aren't from the CSUN community or are not familiar with the Institute, we've been around for about 12 years now, since 2008. And our mission is to help educate and promote and facilitate discussions and curriculum and all kinds of programming around sustainability and regeneration, and really helping everyone at CSUN, but also throughout the larger community, to think about sustainability and how it impacts their lives, and how we could also advocate for a policy change at a larger level. So I have here a bunch of co-hosts who are from the Institute. We've got Sarah Johnson, who's a program analyst. I think we have, I don't see everybody here. I think we have Helen Simonian, who is our administrative analyst. We have Aline and Yesenia, and I don't know if Sam's on the call as well, but we've got a bunch of our staff here at the Institute who are going to help manage some of the chats, and it will be up, we'll be throwing out links and stuff as we're talking. So if you have questions, obviously, I'm sure many of you are now familiar. We're all familiar with Zoom now. So if you have questions, feel free to plug them in the chat, and we'll try to get to them. So, and with that said, Sarah, I think Sarah is going to also post a post survey of the talk with some very quick impressions of what you got out of the this excellent talk. We're going to hear from Rose in a second, who I'm going to introduce. And there's a few more of these this month, or during Earth Month, and we're scheduling another series of these probably in May as well. So keep updated on our website, and we'll keep you posted as well. There's also a seed distribution program, which many of you have probably signed up for, and that's also on our website. And we'll maybe at some point we'll put that on our chat section. We can put some of the links for that as well. So the seed distribution program is meant to complement these series of workshops. So you could actually, we've ordered a lot of seeds, stockpiling seeds, like many of us. I'm sure Rose will talk about that today. And we are making them available for folks in the community to, and we could send them to you. You could start planning now. You could start your victory garden today. Okay, so that's actually a good segue to a good friend of mine who I want to introduce. Dr. Rose Hayden-Smith is recently emeritus, congratulations, and an author and advocate for sustainable food systems and food systems change. She's the founding editor and curator of the UC Food Observer blog, which was launched in 2015 as part of the University of California's Global Food Initiative. Her book, Sowing the Seeds of Victory, American Gardening Programs of World War I, was published by McFarland Press in 2014. And I think she's going to be talking about that today. Again, recently emeritus from the University of California. Rose was formerly a 4-H and Master Gardener Advisor, and also the director for the Cooperative Extension, UCCE in Ventura County. She leads UC's A&R statewide strategic initiatives in sustainable food systems. She has developed programs for youth and adult extenders in food systems and agricultural literacy, garden-based learning, and gardening. She's a very busy person. She is practicing, she's got a PhD in history. She's a fellow historian, like myself, who is, and her book is about some of this history. And she's a nationally recognized expert in the history of victory gardens, extension education, food policy, and the American Home Front in wartime. She was a Kellogg Food and Society Policy Fellow, where her work was focused on digital advocacy to promote gardening. She's also the recipient of UC Davis's Bradford Rominger Award for her career work in promoting sustainable agriculture. Rose also received UCSB's, UC Santa Barbara's Robert Kelly Fellowship for outstanding work in U.S. public and intellectual history. In addition to all this, she's also has a long career as a writer and marketing communication specialist in technology. And as I mentioned, she has her BA in English, Master's in Education and History, and PhD in History from UC Santa Barbara. She's also a very busy person, especially these days, as you can imagine, who is sought after for interviews and for sessions like this to talk about urban farming and talk about school gardens and victory gardens. She was just recently featured in the New York Times, and I'm sure that's going to make her even busier. So we really, really appreciate and we're grateful for your time today, Rose. So I'll turn it over to you. So thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for having me. It's so much fun to see you even in these circumstances. And that was a very nice introduction. Thank you. What that introduction means actually is that I'm old. And when my family first moved to California, decades and decades and decades and decades ago, the first place we lived was right by the Northridge campus, which was really just getting started at the time, and surrounded by beautiful citrus orchards. And what a great introduction to life in California. So today what I'm going to do is go through some slides and talk to you a little bit about gardening in crisis. And I regard gardening in crisis as an American norm. And what we need to do is we need to stop only gardening in crisis and garden in ways that are radical and energetic and integrated into all sorts of educational and community and government systems in all times. So I'm going to go ahead and play this from the start. So again, so I am an historian, but I spent a large part of my career actually as a garden-based learning practitioner. So I taught people how to do school gardens, and I would work with educators, and I actually, did school gardening as an activity at a particular school for 7 years. I've run a master gardener program. So again, I'm really focused on the practitioner piece. And it wasn't until I was actually in my early 40s when I decided that I was really engaged with the history of this too, because the more I learned about the history of gardening in this nation, the more I realized that things are not always the way they are now is not how they've always been, and that these models that we had done in the past could be really informative to current public policy. And just because these things are from the past doesn't mean that they don't hold value. And so I actually got a Kellogg Foundation fellowship and spent a couple of years working on digital campaigns to advocate for school, home, and community gardens to sort of try to create a new garden movement. So, some history about gardening in America. So we were not all farmers at origin, but I think in many ways in our hearts as Americans, we really relate to the idea of coming from a farming tradition and the sort of Thomas Jefferson yeoman farmer, and that sort of cultural tradition, that land is very important to us. And so Americans have always gardened. My hometown is Philadelphia, and if you know anything about Philadelphia, you know that it was actually planned pretty well. And it was planned with lots of space, even in the urban core, for people to have gardens. And then there were sort of common areas, and then moving out to farms on the periphery. And so I grew up in Philadelphia as a gardening city. I lived for a long time in that midst. And so I think that America really has this strong history of kitchen gardening and things like that. So where, in terms of gardening of crisis, things really took off in this nation is something called the Panic of 1893, which was an economic downturn. People were thrown out of work. But imagine in 1893, we don't have these social safety nets, right? We don't have unemployment insurance. We don't have SNAP or things like that. And if you were poor and struggling, the situation was really grim. And so there was a big concern about the impacts of this panic of 1893 in especially urban areas and the potential for civil unrest. Because let me tell you, Americans have a history of sort of activism around food. So you could look at one thing about the American Revolution, that a lot of the tension had to do with sort of tariffs on food products, right? And you have, people throwing tea in the Boston Harbor, but you also had, during the American Civil War, Southern women creating a significant amount of internal dissent and pressure on the Confederacy when, Southern women staged bread riots in Richmond, Virginia, and other places, because, this is America and people get moody when they can't access food, understandably. So to sort of forestall civil unrest around food, and also to help people, these potato patches arose in urban areas. And the place where it actually got to start was the city of Detroit, which had as its mayor an actual socialist named Hazen Pingree. And they created a program in Detroit that other cities quickly modeled other programs on. And these, by mid-1890s, there was actually a national vacant lot cultivation association. So this crisis gardening really did help accomplish a lot of things, including keeping people fed. And gardens also were a site of sort of progressive reform. You had, social change agents who thought that teaching urban kids to garden would help, alleviate some of the distress of these very poor, packed urban areas. You had other groups focusing on gardening as civic beautification and the City Beautiful movement. And school gardens were a huge deal, even, early in the last century, a very, very big deal. So the U.S. enters the World War in 1917. And, there are a lot of concerns. And so a program was created that was kind of a hybrid public-private interest program, because the federal government was pretty small in World War I. And so this national program arose. It was very grassroots in nature, I might add. So food will win the war. That was actually a statement that Woodrow Wilson said in his address to Congress declaring war on Germany. Food will win the war. So I'm going to include in this talk some posters, because one of my areas of study is art history, and I'm really taken with the posters of World War I and World War II. I think they're really interesting, and I want you to think about these posters within the context that these were the social media of their day, right? And so no Instagram, no Facebook, but posters everywhere. So look at this one. Uncle Sam says garden to cut food costs. Right here it says city garden, farm gardens. If you look at the background of the image, the actual garden, it's in the shape of an American flag. And you see a lot of sort of hidden messages in these posters. So this national program, this Liberty Garden program that very quickly began being called a Victory Garden program, it was framed on multiple fronts. But the idea was to promote school, home, and community gardens. And the idea was that they were essential to national security. And in fact, there was a youth program called the United States School Garden Army. And I want to make it clear, I don't love this militarized rhetoric, but I do think it's an interesting point in history that you're calling the school garden program an army because you're trying to mobilize youth to grow food. And Woodrow Wilson funded the program with money from the War Department. So let me ask you now, what if we shifted our idea of national security to national security really being food security and the health of people that live in our country? And if you could, take money that we might spend on traditional military uses and instead take some of it and put it towards community projects that would increase community-based food security and health and accomplish all sorts of other goals. So anyway, I digress. This poster, War Gardens Over the Top, this was created by a woman named Magnell Wright Barney. She was Frank Lloyd Wright's sister. She was an incredibly famous artist. She was a children's illustrator. Her work appeared in magazines, in books. People knew her in this period, and she made a series of posters for the government at all levels to use in the school garden effort. And I want you to think about this. I mean, you all know what over the top means within the context of World War I, trench warfare. So this poster for kids is saying war gardens over the top, right? And I think it's really interesting. And these were very impactful on children. So the goals of this World War program to prevent civil unrest, to alleviate labor shortages, because America had a draft in World War I. And even though farmers were exempt, lots and lots of farmers went to the battlefront. And in the community I live in, Ventura, there was a pretty large population of German people of German descent, and those farmers all dropped their hoes and they went because they wanted to prove that they were American to the core. And so there were labor shortages in agriculture, and that was, a big deal. So our European allies in World War I have been at war for 4 years, and civilians are literally starving. So America is sending all this food to Europe and wants to send more. And so the idea also is that we have to feed troops. And so there is a concern about the food system, because the food system was, supply, distribution, things like that, not organized in the way that our food system's organized today, which is largely, in many ways, a result of New Deal policies, right? So this is earlier than that. And a big concern, too, was to strengthen democracy. You had the organizers of this program being very concerned because 20% maybe, 18-20% of people living on the American home front were first or second generation immigrants. And the government was worried, would these people be loyal? And of course, they were loyal. But the government wanted to strengthen democracy. So the other goal, which I found really interesting, was to actually reduce the food mile. And, I always think of the food mile as being a term from the 90s that came out of some studies in Iowa. But actually, the term food mile appears in World War I literature. And you'll see in some of the posters that they actually suggest local food. And so, there were issues with distribution at that time. There was also one of the primary purposes about these programs in World War I, too, was to teach youth about food, because the federal government was very concerned about the rural depopulation to the cities and where the next generation of farmers would come from. Also, concerns about American nutrition, and again, mobilize citizens around something. So look at this poster here. Follow the Pied Piper. Join the United States School Garden Army. So you've got Uncle Sam here. look at this background. I am not making this stuff up. Shape of an American flag, right? And then you see that, the girl is not allowed to handle a tool. She's sort of sowing seeds reproductively, and she's got like a little military rucksack there. These posters are absolutely beautiful. And by the way, I want to point out, go back a slide. Food is ammunition, don't waste it. What a message, right? About food conservation and food preservation, huge theme in World War I. And again, sort of conflating and connecting the idea of home gardens, food preservation, food conservation with military purposes. Really interesting. So your garden guide, which is a 32-page garden guide that any American could get their hands on in multiple languages. The letter to you came from Newton Baker, who was the Secretary of War. And so you're not getting this from, your local garden center. This is coming to you from basically the War Department is funding the printing of this. And by the way, you can get this bulletin online. And, with the exception of really bad pest advice involving lead, arsenic, things like that, it's actually really good. It had seasonal growing suggestions for different regions of the country, how to construct cold frames. This is a really good document. And part of the availability of information like this on the American home front is a direct result of the land grant universities and what were called the ag experiment stations in each state, which became the cooperative extension service, which I was employed by. Yvonne Savio, who's coming to speak to you next week, a Master Gardener program coordinator before she retired. Master Gardener program is a USDA program in connection with land grant, in connection with your county government. So this agricultural information available to you because of Abraham Lincoln and the Morrill Land Grant Act, and Woodrow Wilson, who, not my favorite president, but he did sign Smith-Lever. Okay, so another wild thing about these programs in World War I is you had a group of women who were organized in part by the National Suffrage Party, who decided to create a woman's land army. And they were mostly college-educated urban and suburban women. And many of them were committed to the idea that they would use their service as farmers and as ag laborers to earn the right to vote. And in California, they organized so strongly, and there were women from UCLA, which actually was then the southern section of Berkeley, and there were women from Berkeley, which was the flagship ag campus, private colleges, and they issued a labor manifesto in California, and they secured rights that eluded farm laborers and immigrant farm laborers for decades because they were white women. Right? And so the girl on the land serves the nation's need. Just sort of want to look at this image artistically as women with bobbed hair, wearing pants, sort of foreshadowing the flapper of the 20s, right? And look at them, they're tough. They're holding hose. Here's an image from the U.S. School Garden Army. Look at this young guy with the sun rising up behind him, enterprising young American entrepreneur and his little American tie. He's great, right? So you could also register your war garden. And I mean, look at this imagery. So this would be a poster that you could get, that you could put in your front window, and feed yourself. A war garden will do it. To destroy the food supply is to give comfort to the enemy. Exempt no land. The federal government was telling people no slacker land. Slacker is not a term from the 90s or the 80s. It is a term from World War I that's incredibly pejorative to refer to draft dodgers. So the federal government is telling people exempt no land. Everything has to be harnessed for the purpose of war. Be a soldier of the soil, the big sort of war eagle on top of it all, a cannon shooting out vegetables. This is amazing stuff, right? But it was a big success. By 1918, the US was exporting 3 times as much grain, meat, sugar as before the war, right? And look at this Lady Liberty poster. This is one of my favorite posters. This poster is the cover of my book. I love it. And during this period, there was a lot about sort of creating that myth of American exceptionalism. And what it really started connecting to in World War I was these well-fed GIs, relatively going abroad, and the sort of sheer strength of them. And then in World War II, you see that, America is in many ways driving a national food agenda. World War II GIs that are going into areas that are, being released from enemy control are carrying in their backpacks food gifts for civilian populations, including Hershey's, chocolate, and instant coffee. So the Depression era, right? After World War I, we go right into a depression. And I know that we're always told, 1929, stock market crash. No, no, no. For agricultural and rural areas, the Depression was 10 years earlier, right? Right after World War I. And so during the Depression era, you had the federal government actually in the early years, they dumped millions and millions of dollars into relief gardening at community level efforts. But then after 3 or 4 years, they sort of diverted the money. But there were all sorts of relief gardening schemes, local, state, and even federal. But one of the things that I think is really interesting, that would be an interesting area of research for some of you guys, is this subsistence urban homesteads model, because there was a lot of it in LA County. LA County was one of sort of the epicenters of this model. They were also called little farms, small farm homes. They started in the late 20s and they actually went into the 50s. And so you go places like El Monte, you still see, in parts of Los Angeles County where, you've all been in those neighborhoods. You go and they're like these little tiny houses and like they're actually on huge lots, right? What's that about? This is what that's about. And in 1949, there were 10,000 families in Los Angeles County living on small farms, 1 acre or less. And this was a really successful program, super interesting, lots about it in the local sort of history. Okay, so World War II begins, Victory Gardens to the rescue. So just to let you know how important it is, and the thing that changed, the federal government is gone through a process of statism. So we have a pretty sizable federal government in World War II. World War I, we didn't. To give you an idea, in World War I, and Dr. Zabia might have to correct me on this. So we drafted, I think, World War I. Ultimately, it was a couple of million men. We mobilized 1.3 million men to Europe, which was wild for America because previously we had maybe sent a couple hundred Marines to hot spots around the globe. We were not about standing armies. That changed this last century. World War II, we drafted and mobilized during 4 years more than 10 million American men. And, you know, World War II, in terms of shaking things up culturally in America and in migration around the country, um, the greatest period of sort of, you've got these streams of people going all sorts of places. And so 2 weeks after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the USDA, so this is 1941, this is December, they convene a national war garden defense conference. And they say, a couple of the people that were very big at the USDA had Liberty Gardens as kids. And they said this program was great. So right away, they're rolling out this in December of 41. And the goals were very different, though, because the food supply was very secure, because we've gone through this very painful, awful restructuring of agriculture and the food system as part of New Deal politics. And part of it has been that, to create a food system that is pretty resilient. So the goals of the World War II Victory Garden program are to increase local production, to mobilize citizens to grow food even in cities, and to improve health, to encourage the storage and preservation of food and reduce food costs. And these last two are impulses from the Depression. But I want to point something else out about the improved health. The federal government actually had a for it. They called it nutritional defense, because the drafts of 2 world wars had revealed to the federal government that the health of Americans in general could be better, and a lot of it had to do with nutrition. So there was this framing that nutritional defense and the health of our citizens, and the idea of your health being an obligation of citizenship, really strongly promoted. Can all you can, it's a real war job. Here's Vice President Henry Wallace in his Victory Garden. And for those of you who don't know Henry Wallace was actually the USDA secretary who oversaw sort of the New Deal agricultural policy makeover, right? And he was Roosevelt's he was a first-term VP, or a second term, I don't know, he was only a one-term VP. And so here's his son, obviously looking super engaged, right? Really happy to be gardening with Dad. So this poster is my favorite of all time. It was actually first issued in 1919. It was reissued in World War II by the Food Administration and the USDA. Buy it with thought, cook it with care, use less wheat and meat, buy local foods. So again, point number 4, this is a federal government message in 1919. So the local food movement is not new, right? So the World War II Victory Garden program, it's estimated there were 20 million gardens in 1943. The peak in World War I, with a much smaller population, was 5.3 million gardens in World War I. It's estimated that 3/5 of Americans garden. I don't know, these are government figures, but one of the kind of pretty firm statistics is that this World War II was a period of high consumption of fruits and vegetables for Americans, and 40% of fresh fruits and vegetables produced on the home front in World War II were produced in home gardens. And I look at this now, and I'm going to give you a little perspective about what's going on now and this food preservation. So I have some buddies who work at Oregon State University in the extension program, and they have a really good master gardening program, and they have online video. They've moved a lot of their courses online before COVID-19, which I think, super smart educational strategy. So they made their basic online vegetable gardening course, which I highly recommend, available online free of charge. And normally they get like a couple hundred registrations a year. So like 2 weeks ago, I hung out with them online. They had gotten 19,000 registrations, and their curve was like the infection curve, right? It was like straight up. They had 100,000 hits visits to their website. And, absolutely insane. This interest in gardening and food preservation. If you work in an extension office right now, you're swamped with phone calls and emails. So what's happened since then? So World War II, one of the things that kind of happened is we moved from a regional to a more of a national cuisine. So real Italian food during that you might, like if you were feeding the troops in World War II, you wouldn't give them real Italian food. You would give them something like Chef Boyardee and call it Italian food, right? So you kind of have this more national cuisine, and the food system is really consolidated, right? There are some in the food system, the primary one being a national highway system. And shout out to Dwight Eisenhower, who made that happen. At least made the legislation happen, enabled that. And part of the reason he was so committed to that is as a World War I officer, he was tasked with a group of people in testing road readiness in the United States, and it was really bad. And so one of his goals as president was to create this national highway system, which has made it that we can move food around anywhere, which is why, people on the East Coast in February can eat these wonderful strawberries that come out of Ventura County, or citrus from LA or Ventura County, right? There were also a lot of societal changes. More women entering the workforce, more processed and convenience foods, the rise of suburbs and lawns. Okay, but here are some other gardening surges that are also linked to crises. Late 1960s, early 1970s, back to land movement, the Earth Day and the environmental movement. And I want to, remind you, 50th anniversary of Earth Day is coming up, right? Like in the next week or so. And, Earth Day, I think we sometimes forget what a crisis that was when that oil platform blew out in the Santa Barbara Channel. And for, people like me, I was a little kid. My family had a little beach shack in Carpinteria, and we were there a lot. I seared in my memory. So that was a crisis, and that drove in some ways a wide range of responses, including gardening. In the 2000s, school gardenings were all the rage again. California actually had an Assembly Bill 1535, the Children's School Garden Instructional Act. We had a Secretary of Education in the state who wanted a school in every garden, a child's garden of standards, basically integrating gardening across the state curriculum was developed. And that happened in 2006. Michelle Obama with the White House garden, and also the USDA People's Garden the same years. And during the Obama years, it was like gardening and sustainability heyday, right? I mean, this sort of surge in supportive and linked efforts like Food Corps, the changes in SNAP where you could use SNAP benefits to purchase gardening supplies, the Know Your Farmer, Know Your Food, the little hub portal, which, the Trump administration has killed, the CDFA community food security grants, stuff like that. So here's the Fenway Farms, just putting this in here. There has been gardening at the spot near Fenway Park since World War I continuously. So here's what I think we need to do right now. So I have a 7-plank platform I am running to be your local garden advocate. I think that food is fundamental, right? We're finding that out now. People, complaining about toilet paper. Oh, folks, we have no idea about the disruptions that are coming our way with the shutdown of, these highly concentrated, centralized meat processing plants, for example, like Smithfield. We are just starting to see disruptions in the food system. We've been really lucky so far. All hands on the hoe. Everyone should know how to garden. And that's not just me saying that. That is Abraham Lincoln saying that, who told people that as long as Americans knew how to cultivate any size plot of land, that we would be free from oppression of all kinds, including free from the oppression of kings and moneylenders. So I think we actually need to mandate a broadly agriculture, environmental education curriculum from K on up, spiral it through. Kids need to know about climate and environment, and they need to know about where their food comes from. And that will also help us become better at science, which we sorely need to do. Food production is vital to national security. And so my thinking is maybe, we should be paying attention to, as a nation, we've sold a lot of farmland in the last decade and, to foreign corporations. And in fact, the Smithfield plant in South Dakota is owned by the Chinese. And I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with a foreign country having bought these legally, which they did. And I just am saying that we don't own our processing capacity. And that concerns me. And that the larger these processing things get, it pushes smaller and medium-sized farmers out. And they have no place to process. So if you can't, if you're a small scale farmer, go to Smithfield and say, process my pork. You have to be under contract with Smithfield as a farmer to process pork. So we really need to rethink how we do food processing in this country. So we need to strengthen our role in a changing world. And this doesn't mean pulling back. It means doing things that we've done. We actually have a foreign ag service in this country that has been like an agricultural Peace Corps that is not functioning very well now, but functioned very well in previous administrations. And then agriculture as civic education and engagement sees this chance to take action. So that's what I've got for you right now. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen and just answer any questions you have.
Well, thank you. Wow. Really some incredible images there. And you answered some of the questions I was going to ask, but maybe I've your plan as our garden advocate, which is really both exciting, but then it highlights the perils. So you said we have no idea what's coming down in terms of the disruptions to the food system. Worried about toilet paper right now, but right. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that. What do you see as, it could be specific, or just what are some of the challenges and opportunities you see that are going to emerge in this crisis we're in?
Okay, so a couple of opportunities that I think are going to emerge is one of the things is if you had told me 4 months ago that the public would be applauding people who work in the food chain, like grocery workers and stuff like that, I wouldn't have believed it. And I think that this situation, as terrible as the situation is, I think it is really helping to advance awareness of how hard the people who work in the food supply chain work, how underpaid it is, and in general, how risky some of the work is. Farm work is very dangerous, right? That I think that we're going to emerge from this with a really elevated and long overdue appreciation of those folks who do that work. And for that, I'm really glad. I also think too that this gardening thing is not going to stop. I think people are going to be very urgent about gardening. And we have another thing driving this that we didn't even have so much in the Obama administration, and that's social media. I mean, when you think about it, I've been on Facebook like 12 years. That was like right at the beginning of sort of like the Obama years. And we didn't have Instagram or things like that. I think the way that I'm seeing people share gardening information and information about seeds and where to get things on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram is really powerful. And I think this has shaken so many of us to our core in a way that people are going to be really dedicated to community at home and community food projects.
Yeah. So, I think, and by the way, as I'm talking, feel free to, if anyone has questions, you could jump in, or you could chat it on the side here, and I could read it to Rose as well. So, so I had a question actually about, you mentioned a little bit about the school, the education of young gardeners, right? And how we know that is of course, the kids are the future, and reprogramming the kids and the kids get it, right? You throw them in the garden, they get it in ways that are, for those of us who aren't in the garden all the time, it's much more intuitive, it seems. So I guess my question is about the curriculum, because I know you have a lot of experience doing this and working with K through 12 students, or particularly elementary school students in Ventura County, and because that Ventura County is a little bit of a different, there's some similarities, but it's different than LA County, right? It's definitely more ag oriented. So what kinds of, I guess, where do you see the school system and what do you see the school and education playing a role in this food system, the kind of larger food policy? Do you see more of a connection as you talked about and highlighted in World War I and World War II between the government and education and food policy?
Yeah, I really do. And I have to tell you another thing that a lot of us have known for a long time, but this situation has really highlighted, is just how tenuous our ability to keep kids fed is. And I have a friend who lives in Kentucky, and she was reporting to me that that she had neighbors whose kids get the school lunch, and these schools have been heroic, right? Like in my community, they have opened up 10 sites, and they said, anyone you show up there, we'll give you stuff. So people are putting themselves out there. And then in other places, like where my friend lives in Kentucky, the school bus drivers were delivering breakfast and lunch. But when my friend told me what was in those breakfast and lunches, it was like, holy cow. Yeah. It's like chips and donuts and whatever they could scrounge up. And I think that this situation, I think, we are going to come away once we sort of regather our feet, and it's going to be a while. I think some of us are not going to be fully back into the swing of things until 2022, because that's how long it's going to take to roll out vaccinations and everything. I mean, that's my opinion. But I think that we are going to have to focus on schools where we are working with schools to do more school gardens that go into the cafeteria, and where we are having more of the kind of school kitchens I grew up with, which are the cooking from scratch kitchens, right? Not just the heat and serve. And I think another thing too, Nate, that people are not talking about that is really important is this is also going to accelerate the reform of higher education. And that is going to feed out, because I have a lot of young friends who obviously are taking a gap year next year. And I think that you're going to have a lot of people who are going to go, in the big scheme of things, do I need a college degree, or can I do it without a college degree? And I think that there's going to be the potential, if we do it right and have the right leadership coming out of it, of having a huge national core of young people who can help us rebuild and correct a lot of the things that system-wise, every system we have just about has broken down in this.
Yeah, it's extraordinary. Yeah. Actually, so that leaves actually some great questions here from some folks about a little more, I guess, since you are, because I did also want to ask about your garden, what you're growing, what are you prioritizing these days? And then that's a lead into a couple folks here have asked about what's the easiest and quickest to grow nutritious plants, someone who's really right at the beginning of gardening. So what might you recommend? Yeah.
Okay, so this kind of caught us a little flat-footed because it was like kind of early. And so I did something that I have never done before. And I actually got my tomato plants from Burpees. And they delivered them, and it wasn't there was no price gouging or anything like that. We had some other things on hands, and so what we're focusing on right now is we have a ton of fruit in our backyard, and then we're doing tomatoes. And one of the things that I'm doing this year is I just put like herb garden in my kitchen just for the sort of comfort. I mean, it's not going to do a lot of feeding, but if I were, starting a garden now, I mean, gosh, for sure, tomatoes, squash, right? That stuff's prolific. And I would do some root vegetables. And I think that you don't need fancy stuff to do it. Right? You don't need fancy tools or fancy equipment. And I also have to tell you too, that if you're having problems finding plant material or seeds, my experience right now, I've got a friend of mine who's mailing me zinnia seeds. And people are doing a lot of this in safe ways. And so I had a friend the other day who needed a certain kind of plant material and was out of a certain kind of soil. And she put out a call on our Facebook group, and someone in a socially safe way dropped it off within a couple of hours.
And that's actually, you did a nice little plug for our seed distribution program, because we've been thinking about what's the safest and most effective, most efficient way to deliver. And right now we're mailing them, but we see this as this progresses, there might be other resources that people need, soil or seedlings, so we're trying to actually connect with, there's a few local farmers in the Valley that are local urban farmers who have been partnering with us, and they've offered their farms that like 1 or 2 acre farms as pickup points, as well as we have a garden on campus as well that we're going to identify as a pickup point. So once you establish the protocols and the safe, and kind of for the reality we're in, it really, then you start seeing the community come together and start seed sharing and resource sharing, and that's, as you know, right, that's the beautiful thing about gardens and seeds, is that it's abundancy. It's actually, nature is abundant. It's not a zero sum. This is the beauty of it, right? And then it almost forces you to and weeds don't abide by the borders. So it's almost like when you have to think like community when you're gardening, really. Actually, so there's another question about soil. This is specific, so you're an expert. So this question about soil, does it matter? Do you need different kinds of soil for fruit trees or for vegetables? I mean, I guess it's more of a question of what kinds of preparation would you recommend for, you said it's pretty easy, and that is true. That's the beauty of it for some of these things. I guess, what kinds of preparation do you think might be in order to do some of these squashes and other kinds of
so and these questions also, make sure you come back next week, because Yvonne is like the bomb on this stuff. But so my thing about urban gardening in particular is I like to garden in raised beds, because I've gardened a lot with kids, so I've gotten used to raised beds. And and also too, I find it easier to sort of make that soil really good.
Yes. Right.
Clearly, my trees are not in raised beds, but I know that where I live, it was a walnut
Wow.
orchard,
Yeah.
and so I know that there were not commercial uses before I lived here. But I think if you live in an urban area and you're going to do in-ground planting, you probably need to do some soil testing to make sure that you're not, there aren't like heavy metals or something like that.
Yeah.
But I know that a lot of the gardening companies, they try to sell you these specialized soils, right? You don't really need that. You just need good soil. And again, the nurseries are open, like Green Thumb Nursery. If you need supplies, we didn't do it, but other people have done it. You call, you place an order, and then you drive through and they drop it in your trunk.
Exactly.
And
I've done
because
that.
yeah, right. And so, but I don't think you need to buy an expensive soil. And I think also this is a perfect time to do composting and worm composting. Like, and there are the easiest instructions online for worm bins. Right now.
And we've got actually, for those of you who are interested in that, we have on our website, we have a little web pagelet under the virtual Victory Garden workshops, where we have exactly these kinds of things, little links to very basic, vermicomposting is like the simplest thing, that it's such a powerful tool for the gardener who doesn't have a huge amount of space either. We actually have one right on our balcony. We have a little balcony, little garden. We've got a little, the little plastic, basically a little plastic bin where you put the food scraps and the worms, and then you can create soil that way.
Right.
Yeah. So Rose, we're actually at the end of our talk, and we really appreciate your time and the beautiful slides and the historical perspective. I think it's so critical, and we hope we can have you come on campus when we get to the other side of this curve, and have you talk more and have you talk about maybe we'll be farther along on your implementation plan, and hopefully we'll be partners in that as well.
Well, I hope you all will implement the plan. But thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure to speak to you guys.
Yeah. You too. All right. Well, thank you so much. Thanks everybody for coming. We'll see you next one. Bye.